legalisefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. Legalisefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegaliseFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Simon Siddol, who joins us to discuss the trend in Western popular music towards the inane, the robotic and the infantile, a social engineering agenda pushed hard by the handful of multinational corporations that sit atop the music industry pyramid. Siddol believes that this degradation of Western music has been happening for centuries, so old and so deeply ingrained that elements of this pernicious anti-consciousness agenda are now part of the musical DNA of even the most well-meaning and conscious musicians. It's the perfect subconscious mind control mechanism. We're using what is in reality a shamanic mind-altering tool for recreational jollies en masse, and it's ruining people's psychic health and the health of our entire society. But strategies exist for both music lovers and musicians to help them detox from the attitudes, beliefs and behaviours around music that slowly but surely dehumanise us. Hello and welcome, Simon. Thank you so much for joining us today on LegaliseFreedom.com.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I've enjoyed your show for years and it's really quite a buzz to be on the other side of the mic.
Well, thank you very much. That's really much appreciated. Now, your work came to my attention through the course that you offer, basically entitled Poisonous Music. Now, we're going to be talking about what that means, the implications of that, and how you see the role of music, past, present, and future. Before we jump into that, for listeners who don't know, tell them a little bit about your background and your work in general.
Okay. I'm a lifelong musician. I'm a pianist, a composer, an improviser, and a teacher. If you understand such symbologies, then I can tell you that I'm a Scorpio sun sign with lots of Libran and Sagittarian energy in me. And if you understand Myers-Briggs typings, I'm an INTP, which makes me very much into analysis and synthesis. I was nearly a child prodigy. I started studying music too late. I was nearly 11 when I started. So the consequence of that was that by the time I'd come to the age that I could have been admitted into a Royal College of Music or something like that, I wasn't quite at the, technically on fire level that they wanted at that age. So I ended up going to De Montfort University, where they offered a course which studied 20th century music and experimental music. When I was there, I studied with a teacher called Suzanne Cheetham, who's a student with Yvonne Loriot, who is Olivier Messiaen's second wife and his greatest interpreter. So that's my pianistic pedigree, if you like. And while I was there, I performed such solo works as John Adams' Phrygian Gates, and my third-year recital, I performed Charles Ives' Concord Sonata, which is quite a mountain in the piano literature. I also was part of a group which was only the second group outside of Steve Reich's own musicians group to play Steve Reich's music for 18 musicians. And I was also involved in quite a lot of other hardcore 60s and 70s minimalist performances. Outside of college and music study, I was already, by the age of 13, studying astrology and reading such things as Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger series. And by the time I was at college, I was also taking my fair share of LSD, which kept my mind very open to different viewpoints during a time in my life where, by the nature of university, they're actually trying to solidify your viewpoints as you go along. So After college, I basically made a living as a piano teacher. It was the easiest way to make a living. And I carried on studying lots of occult subjects. And then in 1998, I think it was, I got the internet and immediately plunged into studying conspiracy. I'd always been suspicious of the world around me, and this just joined up with my thinking. I also, at the time, started using some of the things, the mind-altering techniques I'd been learning from such people as Robert Anton Wilson, and I started using them in my piano teaching. And this developed to the point that by my 30s, I'd become a kind of musician's medicine man, where I was able to find deep psychological and neurological blocks in musicians and sort them out in fairly short order, so that other teachers would end up sending their problem students to me for a few sessions to get them past their problems. And through my teaching, I began to realize that I was a recovering empath as well, by which I mean that I could, while stood across the other side of the room from my students, facing away with them with my eyes closed, I could still feel their muscle tensions, their nervous tensions, their thoughts as they were playing. And I began to realize that this was part of what I'd lived through my entire life, was being an energy sensitive and living in a world where this had never been explained to me, and I'd been, troubling with it, putting up with it, trying to cope with it for years without having any understanding of what it really was. And it was actually through my teaching that I began to recover that sense of myself. So from then on, it became really quite an obvious path. It became a living truth to me that all music was actually a shamanic enterprise, by which I mean an enterprise that is intended to alter the mind and the emotions and the body. And as I was looking at the positive aspects of all of this, it began to dawn on me in the way that it only dawns on people when they've been repressing something their entire lives, avoiding it out of fear, that music had the capacity to do as much damage by that same route as it did good. And that's when I started on my path towards creating this thing I have now called the Conscious Music School.
Okay, so that's pretty comprehensive explanation of where you've come from, where you are, where you might be going. I can certainly identify with a lot of that in terms of my own musical journey. Mm-hmm. And one thing, just what you said just at the end there, I think a lot of people will probably raise an eyebrow when you talk about music having the capacity to do as much damage as it does good, because in my experience, a lot of people go through a similar sort of arc when it comes to music. It may be something they have no particular interest in when they're very young. And bear in mind that I'm speaking as someone who's middle-aged now, so the landscape has changed in terms of what entertainment and what distractions are available to children these days and to young adults, teenagers. That has definitely changed since I was young. However, of the people of my generation, there was, say, perhaps very little interest in music when you were little. There might be music in the household, there might not be, but it's very much a cliche that when you got into your teenage years, it was one of those things that you started to take an interest in, partly because your peers were taking an interest in. If you might take interest in members of the opposite sex, or if you're that way inclined, members of the same sex, but you have a kind of a sexual awakening is beginning to happen. Yep. All sorts of things as you begin to transition from being a child to an adult. And this is where this interest in music comes in. And then the people that have been around me my life, some, like myself, have maintained a very intense interest in music to the point of making it all or part of their living, their career. But most have, even if they're in later life, enjoy music. It's quite often the music that they grew up with. Music's a very nostalgic thing for them as they get older. Their tastes become fossilized. They don't seek out new music, and certainly the role that music may have played during their teenage years, for some people it became everything. It was, they may have even started playing an instrument. That when life comes along, the adult responsibilities of work and children and mortgages and responsibilities, then that interest in music can fade. And that's the very popular arc, the most common arc that I see in people's lives. And just to repeat, I know it's changed now. So when someone like yourself, who's this intense immersion in every aspect of music, when you come along and start talking about music as potentially, to use your word, poisonous, for a lot of people, they're okay, well, we know there's music, we know that there's junk in the charts, but are you serious? I mean, how can it actually damage someone? So, and I think even in the world, I spent a lot of time as a music critic, that even in that world where people who believe they're writing seriously about music, and they're considering music seriously, they're taking it seriously, it is important to them. Not very many kind of cross the Rubicon that you have. So at what point did you really, was it a gradual process of kind of awakening to this, a realization of what music was very important to our ancient ancestors? One of the reasons we maybe don't think so much about that is because we know so little about their music. But and you began to then say, well, that as in terms of sound and sound put together and how it affects our being, our soul, how physically how it affects us, we haven't evolved that much. So I'm just wondering, at what point was there a tipping point, or was it a gradual process where you came to say that there's something malefic at work here, and I need to be talking about this. I need to be,
Okay, well, it actually mirrors the psychological process by which you can come to realize that you've been repressing something an awful long time in your life. It's something that my experience of coming to realize this was essentially a slow but horrific build-up of understood pieces of evidence, sort of piling up against this limit, beyond which was the acknowledgement that music could be poisonous, and I defended myself from it for years, thinking, well, yeah, okay, so you get something like Lady Gaga, putting videos of basically demons up and talking about the dehumanizing things that she talks about. Yes, okay, there's bits of dangerous music in terms of their lyric and video content and stuff like that. I was aware of that for years before I came to realize that actually music itself is a force which can shape our pre-linguistic minds, by which I mean that it's been proven by scientific experiment that music can improve a child's capacity for joined up thinking and language from experiencing complex and subtle music before they can even speak. So music has been demonstrated to have an effect on a part of our mind which is underneath the processing of language. And if you've read any Robert Anton Wilson, you understand that if you get underneath language, what you're getting to there is our belief systems, what he usefully calls our BS. Yeah. So the way that music can produce its own syntax and vocabulary can impress itself onto us. And not only can it do it in our infancy before we're aware of what language does, but it carries on doing that through our life because we are not so aware of how influences below the level of linguistic clarity, linguistic concreteness, can affect us. Yeah. When I began to realize this, it became obvious that just as music, which is deeply complex and richly and subtly inflected and has, complex and interesting form and emotional dynamics in it, there is also music which has none of that stuff, that it is essentially plastic, robotized. Yeah, there's an enormous amount of modern pop music which has had almost all of its human musical subtlety ironed out of it by computers. This kind of music is still giving us an influence, and that influence is be simplistic, be robotized, be ironed out. Also, if you listen to a lot of music which is what I term mono-emotional, meaning music which only sticks in one emotion throughout a song or a piece. Most of the time people are listening to pieces like that to use it as some form of emotional crutch inside themselves, meaning that we can either use that mono-emotional music to inject back into ourselves an emotion that we find missing, or we can use it to uncork and detox from an emotion that we can't get out of ourselves. There's quite a few different functions that music's emotions can have inside us. But what I find is that when we stick to doing that for too long, it becomes very much like using a street drug to sort out your own emotional or psychic state. So, somebody who just has never learned how to calm down properly will be very much open to getting addicted to barbiturates or cannabis, for instance. You can abuse music in the same way, and in the same way that it will have an effect by using drugs like that, you can come to a place where you rely on music to give you the capacity for that emotional dynamism inside yourself. That's at least one aspect of how music can damage us.
Well, I've done a lot of shows touching upon popular culture and the dimensions of that, which are controlling and dumbing down. And a lot of people who will happily listen to whatever the top 10 on the radio in their car as they drive to work, not think twice about it, might at the same time reel against trash TV and just think, oh yeah, it's total mind rot, chewing gum for the eyes, it's just nonsense, it's gibberish. Or they might talk about certain magazines at supermarket checkout. It's, oh my, who reads this stuff, sort of thing. But then for a lot of people, music is, they think of it, even if they don't like particularly highbrow or interesting music from the point of what they what they wouldn't think of themselves as critics, as like how can I put it, in any sort of avant-garde. They say, no, I just like what's on Radio 1, whatever, when the pop, sure. I just want to like what's on the pop station, or, the classic rock or whatever. I like good music, but I don't spend a lot of time. So, but for them, that's almost above what they would see as dumbed down popular culture. And that's an interesting divide for me, that a lot of people don't, I think they see music as, despite it being part of just the popular culture milieu, they'll see it as so throwaway as to almost be like, well, yeah, but how could, we know some people take music seriously, but it's exempt from that in some way, and I think that's perhaps a failure to appreciate how music works, because it's all music is doing something to you all the time, even the blandest, most soporific nonsense.
Yes.
And no matter, how you approach it, it's doing something to you subconsciously. Even if you think, I'm not listening to that, it's just a sound. If you get into an elevator and there's music in there, it's still doing something to you, whether you're aware of it or not. So, and I think a lot of people don't appreciate the power of music.
Music, something I only learnt recently was that when people hear pop music for the first time, say just walking around a shop or something and it's on the radio in the shop, it's quite possible for them to hate it at that moment and then come into the shop another half dozen times over the course of the next 2 weeks. And by the time they've inadvertently, without even thinking about it, heard it 5-6 times, even though they thought they hated it at the start, the sheer familiarity can bring them to a place where when you poll them about such opinions, they say they actually like the music. So it's come to a point where sheer familiarity with a tune has been mistaken for liking something, when actually inside your own mind and your own opinions, nothing has shifted since that first moment when you listened to it and went, this is dreadful. So there's an awful lot of unconscious processing of music going on in Western culture all the time. There's a lot of elements to how this functions and how it's come about, but I would suggest that at least for the last 100 years or so, our culture has been slowly conditioned to consider music as a throwaway, as something that can do no particular harm or good. Yeah, it might make us smile, it might make us dance, it might make us cry once in a while, but, that's 5 minutes of our lives, and then we can put it away and go about our lives. We've been conditioned to ignore the idea that music can be just as much of a life-changing art as the greatest paintings or the greatest sculptures or the greatest literature. It's just dying as an idea inside our culture right now. And I think that's an extremely dangerous movement inside our culture, not least because human beings actually need healthy music to keep them psychically healthy, or at least a lot of them do. But because when we ignore that possibility that music can be a powerful thing to change us, either for good or for bad, then essentially what we're doing is we're stopping guarding our boundaries inside our own psychic containment, and we're inviting in people to take hold of that power vacuum that we are no longer, keeping control of by exercising a conscious choice of why and what we're doing with our music consumption.
Do you think there's any parallel psychologically in the sort of twin processes, one of which you've just described, of being, for example, in a public place, hearing a song, maybe in a shopping mall, and thinking, maybe it's so grating that you take notice of it and just go, oh my God, that's awful. And then 6 months later, you're
coming along.
Yeah, your opinion has somewhat changed. Is there any parallel between that process and the other one, where I know lots of people, and I've been like this myself, who found music to be off-putting or difficult in some way, or just not appealing at first, but spending time with it and actually learning to appreciate that there was depth and subtlety and meaning in it. Because, a lot of music that, many people, music has endured for a long time that many people consider to be great music. You talk about Mozart in your course materials. So there's a process there where you approach something and at first it's off-putting, but then you take time to see the depth in it. So I'm just wondering if there's any similarity between the processes of doing that, but also coming to sort of believe that you like something that at first you couldn't stand.
Well, there's definitely the case that making a conscious study of a complex art form can obviously increase your enjoyment, your understanding, your entire involvement in that. And I think there might be a very slight parallel in that to the idea of simply getting used to a piece of pop music that you hear in a shopping mall. But the difference is that you're not involving yourself consciously in that at all. It's just a matter of getting used to something to the point that your initial distaste, your initial alarms going off in your head about it, get a bit bored of running and stop emphasizing the point so strongly to the point that you just think, oh, well, that's part of the environment now. At which point the simple rhythm underneath it starts to make your foot tap, and you think, oh, okay, this is all right. Yes, I do think there is some connection between the two, but I also think there is some vastly opposite eventual effect from the two.
Well, one thing I've noticed in as far as music in public spaces goes, particularly in stores, because let's face it, that's where a lot of piped music is heard, that I tend to not notice it unless for some unexpected reason I consider it to be good. Not necessarily familiar, but it's usually familiar. And I'll give you an example. Now, you're a UK resident, so a native. You'll be familiar with based in our part of England, actually, Morrison's, the supermarket chain. In my local Morrison's, I feel that whoever's selecting the music, and it may be just a third-party company that they just buy their music from, do an unusually good job of playing quality rock and pop songs from the last several decades. I quite often find myself posting something on social media. Well, Morrison's knocked it out of the park again. There was a great song playing, while I was looking for mushrooms or whatever it happened to be, or tins of beans. So yeah, I'll notice if music in the public sphere like that is, and the point of my point being is that I didn't expect it to be any good. I didn't expect it to have any taste or sound like it was consciously selected. I expected it to be so bland, or so awful that I basically filter it out of my consciousness altogether.
Yeah. Well, I'll reflect back to you another experience I have from living in the north of England, which is going through bus stations. My local bus station, they have constant pipe music on there. I'm reluctant to even call it music. It's stuff produced by somebody who sounds like they've had a digital audio workstation for a couple of weeks. It's so hastily and dodgily put together. And it's so devoid of emotional charge inside this music that it didn't take me long to realize from listening to a playlist that it had been deliberately put together to numb out people's emotions while they were in a bus station. Because for a lot of bus stations around the country, it's a place where people with low emotional intelligence and control will hang out, to put it politely. You get a lot of people who are on the edge of losing it, drifting through bus stations. And I think they came to the conclusion that if they play music which completely numbs out any kind of extreme in people's emotions, they can keep better control inside the space. Now, when you talk about a shop like Morrison's using music for whatever reason it might be, I can't believe that these companies to this day are still just using somebody's arbitrary kind of musical choices, something that somebody loves and they put a mixtape together, if you like, to play in Morrison's. No, I think there is still market and psychological research going on into this. I probably would suggest that if they're playing music that strikes you as happy, cheerful, and familiar to you, then that is the mood they are trying to keep people in while they're in their shop. They've given up on the idea of trying to psychologically drive people into one flavor of emotion with some kind of specialized music, and they've sort of simply come to the conclusion that happy pop music that everybody knows is a fairly effective way of keeping everybody cheerful and moving while they're in their shop.
I think what I've probably appreciated is, bands that I like, for example, The Cure, Depeche Mode. Hearing it in Morrison's, it's on the edge of pop, if you see what I mean. It's pop.
Yeah.
It's pop, but it's kind of pitch black, and it's kind of, that's maybe why it's arrested my attention, because I thought, how did this get through the net? I'm not saying that Morrison's is suddenly like an 80s, haven for lovers of 80s music. It's not. But I just noticed these things. So, but as you say, it's still trying to generate a mood. And we all know the amount of money and research that goes into retail spaces, from whether it's the placing of stock to how you funnel people around a space, how you persuade them to buy something, how you display things. So of course music is always going to be an important part of that. And I think people do understand that. They wouldn't expect to hear avant-garde, electronic instrumental music in a supermarket. It's not going to work. It's going to be jarring.
It's going to push them out, isn't it? Yeah.
The interesting thing that about music, particularly in the bus station, it really made me think of the music in such that it is in science fiction dystopias, where they're set in a bleak, usually consumerist, dumbed down, medicated, highly controlled, quite often, fascist future, where people have very few freedoms, but they may have some comforts that the sort of burbling nonsense music, what we today think of as just royalty free, library music and such like, that tends to set the tone. And it does have that calming effect, especially if you're already chemically altered, shall we put it that way?
Yeah.
In terms of your mood. So when I hear music in elevators or music, I like the music you're describing in the bus station. I just think of people. The classic example would be George Lucas's first film, THX 1138. With these people shuffling around, dead eyes, soulless, and, being last time I was in a bus station, it was in Sheffield, and it was very much like a future dystopia.
What can I say about that? Look at the change between Blade Runner and Blade Runner 2049, for instance. We went from pieces of music that still to this day are considered classics. Yeah, the piano music in the scene in Deckard's house, to 3 trombone notes. The music that was supplied for, is it Hans Zimmer, I think, who wrote the music for Blade Runner 2049. It was compressed down into something which is basically a meme of noise, nothing more. And it's almost like a boiling down into a tiny little spot of this whole sense that you can use music to anesthetize people's souls. You can fill them with sound information which doesn't actually have any enlightening effect on a human psyche. And to people who have not made much of a study of what music is and what music can do, it can pass as music without actually functioning like the original word music meant. I'd just like to explain for a second for your audience the idea of these 2 words, music and entertainment, because they've changed. So music it comes from, where are we now? Yeah, it comes from the Old French musique via Latin, from Greek musica techne, which means art of the muses. Now, the muses were 9 goddesses, the daughters of Zeus, who is the god of mind and will, and Mnemosyne, I think is how you pronounce her name, Mnemosyne, who is the goddess of memory. So art, if you like, of all sorts, is the combination of memory and will. Originally, the word music is an adjective, like the word cubic, artistic, quadratic, citric. Yeah, it's something that describes a quality inside something, not a thing itself. That's actually a really unknown idea in modern society. Music is considered a noun. Worse than a noun, it's considered a commodity. It's not even nowadays considered, as it was before the advent of recording technology, as this wonderful transcendent thing that comes through a musician into the ear of the listener, and then it is gone again, and you have to acknowledge it and cherish it for what it is while it's there. No, now we actually have it on a piece of plastic in our hand, or as a bunch of electrons, in our phone, or whatever it is. It's become a thing, and as such, I see that as what's the word for it? An insult to its original intention, its original meaning. It's a de-holification. I'm sorry, I'm losing my vocabulary here, but I think you get what I mean.
Well, that's an issue in itself, isn't there? Like that expression from years ago, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. It's like trying to find the words in the first place.
Sure.
Now, all of this is not purely accidental in your view. It's not just part of the evolution of culture, the devolution of culture, we might call it. It's not just an artifact of the technological era, from the dawn of recorded music onward. There have been a lot of unintentional side effects and fallout that have affected our culture for various reasons throughout mainly the 20th century now into the 21st. But you believe that there's actually an agenda here, not in everything and always, but nevertheless one can be identified. So perhaps you could talk a little bit more about that, because you did mention at the top of the hour that you developed an interest in conspiracies because you always were a bit uncertain about the world or had your doubts. And I'm very much in the same boat as that. I always felt that there was something missing, or there was something that was there not acknowledged. I felt that there was a lot that that beyond 5 sense reality, a lot that most of us couldn't or wouldn't perceive. That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalisefreedom.com.
Legalisefreedom.com